In light of that jab, that parting jab, I want to tell you all how immensely I respect you all. Anybody who could sit through 40 minutes of grueling, torturous teaching from D. Wood, you're definitely resilient people. So originally I had a PowerPoint presentation for this, but we all went to a mosque before coming here, and it took much more time than we expected. So my laptop is back at the hotel, but that's fine. I was telling somebody just before this, if I couldn't tell you why Christianity is true without my laptop, then I probably ought not be a Christian. But the topic that I'm addressing, why Christianity is true and all other religions are false, that's an apologetics issue. So one of the things that I want to do as we get started is talk about what apologetics is. So David launched right into what he was doing. He was doing apologetics. So you kind of already have an idea of it, even if you came here without any prior understanding. But the reason I want to start with this is also not just because this is an apologetics issue, but in my view, I do think, and this gets into the presuppositional question we had a moment ago, this is part of the concern of the presuppositionalist. I think that a lot of people have a reductionistic view of the task of apologetics. And so let me explain what I mean. If I were to ask you, what does the word apologetics mean? Many people would say it means to give a defense. Now, it's not that that's wrong. The Greek word apologia, from which we get apologetics, means to give a defense. And it's a term that was used this way long before it's found in the New Testament. If you read Plato's work, The Apology, it's all about Socrates' defense of himself when he was brought up on charges in Athens for denying the gods and corrupting the youth. So it's called The Apology. So what Socrates is doing in the dialogue is he's defending himself. He's trying to show that the charges brought against him shouldn't stick. They shouldn't result in a negative verdict against him. However, it's very clear when you read the New Testament that the New Testament authors don't think that that's adequate to what you're supposed to be doing as a Christian. Take the classic text. This is the locus classicus on apologetics. In 1 Peter 3:15, the context is Peter talking about suffering. He says, if you suffer, it should be for the sake of Christ, not because you're a curmudgeon, right? Not because you're a criminal. It should be in the cause of Christ. And he says, you shouldn't fear if you're suffering in this context. First of all, generally speaking, people aren't going to persecute you for doing good. However, if it so happens that you're suffering for doing well, then you're blessed, is what he says. But then he says, in this context, he says, in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense, apologia. But notice how Peter goes on, to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Here he uses the Greek term logos. You may recognize that. That's the word used for Jesus. It's a really fascinating word. When you look at the word in a lexicon, which is a linguistic tool to, you're looking at the scope of a word and trying to determine what possible meanings can it have, and then you look at the context to decide which specific meaning is to be used here. That word has like 50 different possible meanings. It can mean reason, order, logic, discourse, and on and on. In fact, here's something I find especially fascinating since Christ is called the Logos. What's interesting is that this word is used in hundreds of words that we use in the English language. Think, for example, of theology. Theos, logos. That's where you get the word theology. It means God, and then logos. So it means a discourse about God or the study of God or the logic of God. What is it that we think here? So we have theology, it has the word logos in it. We also speak about anthropology, the study of man in relation to God. We speak about Christology, the study of Christ. We talk about eschatology. Many of you probably have heard that word. That's a study of the end times. And it's not just Christian theology, science. Scientists talk about geology, biology, meteorology, zoology, and on and on. It's also used in philosophy, axiology, epistemology, ontology. So you have this word that's the root word is used in all these areas of knowledge. These are all areas of knowledge. And so I find it utterly fascinating that when the Bible wants to talk about Christ, it calls him the Logos. What it's saying is that he's the ultimate explanation for everything. In Colossians 1, it says, in him all things hold together. He's the one that holds reality together. Every atom, every molecule, all of it is held together by Christ. And so the unity that obtains in the world, and I'll come back to some of this, Lord willing, the unity that we find in the world, the reason the world is a cosmos, that's the Greek word meaning an ordered system. The reason it's called a cosmos is because of Christ, according to the Bible. He is the Logos. He is the logic, the rationale that holds it all together. Well, so that's the term that Peter's using here. He's not here referring to Jesus, though he does refer to Jesus, but I mean, when he uses the term Logos, he says, be ready to give to everyone or make a defense to anyone who asks you a reason, a Logos, for the hope that you have. So Peter's talking about the apologetic task as not merely defensive. We're not just showing that the attacks made against our faith are invalid. We're not just showing that this is a erroneous argument against us. For example, if somebody says, here's a contradiction in the Bible, and then you resolve it. You haven't proved Christianity is true by doing that. All you said is, your reason for rejecting it is not valid. It doesn't hold. That is not what the apostles are saying you're supposed to be doing as a Christian. You're to be doing far more than that. You're to be doing far more than that. In fact, one of my favorite passages on the apologetic task is found in 1 Corinthians 10, or actually it's 2 Corinthians 10. In 2 Corinthians 10, Paul's actually talking about issues within the church at Corinth. And so he's even saying there's something of an apologetic task that is directed within, because there are heresies that have come up within the church, there are errors and so forth. So even in the context of the church, there's some room for apologetics. But Paul says in verse 3, he says, though we walk in the flesh, note the turn of phrase here, though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. So we're real human beings, we are in the flesh, but we don't wage war according to the flesh. That is, in the second instance, flesh refers to our fallen nature. So we don't war in this way. We don't war in the sense of taking up arms and engaging in military exploits. He says, for the weapons of our warfare, he says, for though we walk in the flesh, we're not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Note how total the project is there. He's not just talking about defending Christianity. Oh no, those verses don't contradict. Paul is saying we're not only to be engaged in defense, but in offense. We are to utterly rout the unbeliever. His entire worldview is to be decimated. That's what Paul says you're supposed to be doing. So, and that's not it, by the way. There are other passages where the apostles, and maybe this will help show you a little bit more how robust this is. It's not just that apologetics is defensive and offensive, but apologetics is aimed at nothing less than showing the certainty of Christianity. The certainty of Christianity. So even though I, as a presuppositionalist, don't reject the use of evidence, this is usually what's understood by a presuppositionalist. We reject evidence. I certainly don't. I think evidence is abundant. In fact, my claim is everything in the world is evidence for the truth of Christianity, and I'll get to some of that momentarily. But part of the problem, if that's all you're doing is giving evidence, is, and David's a philosopher, he can amen this, evidence only supports a conclusion. It doesn't render it certain. So other arguments for the truth of Christianity or the existence of God end up being probabilistic. That's not to say that there's no other forms that try to be more robust. But generally speaking, the arguments that people give for the truth of Christianity are probabilistic. They might say, I've just proved this to you, but if you were to ask them, have you just shown the necessity, the certainty, the inescapable necessity or reality of Christianity? They'll say no, but it's very likely, it's very probable. There's more reason than not to believe that Christianity is true. But ask yourself, is this what the apostles are talking about? And by the way, although I'm not going to read passages on this, it's very easy to do. Go through the book of Acts and read what it says the apostles did. This is a great exercise for more reasons than this. Sometimes when I go out evangelizing, it helps me to know that this has divine warrant. It has apostolic precedent, because you go out there and the unbeliever will say, why are you doing this? This is offensive to me. It's rude to tell other people they're wrong. And it helps to know that Jesus told you to do this. Sometimes people say, by what authority are you doing this? It's almost like the questions that people put to Jesus. I used to get this from Mormons all the time. They would say, who gave you the authority to come here and say we're wrong? Well, Jesus, right? So when you go through the book of Acts, the apostles are doing just what Jesus told them to do. They're arguing with people. It uses terms for arguing. It says they argued, they reasoned, they persuaded, right? But it also uses the term proved. It speaks of Paul proving that Jesus is the Christ. Luke, in the book of Acts, in the book of Luke, the same author as the author of the book of Acts, at the beginning of his gospel, he talks about Jesus giving many infallible proofs. So the proofs are not, according to Luke, merely probabilistic. There's some way that these evidences are part of an overall apologetic that allows you to definitively prove the truth of Christianity. So the apologetic task involves more than simply refuting objections to the faith or giving some probabilistic reasons for thinking it could be true. Now, I want to bring in one more passage here. Well, really many, but before moving on to another consideration, and it's Romans 1. And this is the text I think that might have been mentioned in the question to David. This is where the idea comes from that everybody knows God. I mean, it's not the only text, but it's the common or the most classic text. But in Romans 1:18, it says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. That's 1:16. I have bad eyesight, by the way, but I refuse to wear glasses. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So he speaks of the revelation of the righteousness of God in the gospel of Christ. But then he goes on to talk about some other revelation of God that stands in contrast to this. Verse 18 says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. Revealed from heaven. Against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. So Paul talks, first of all, about a revelation of God that has been made to men and of man's response to it. Human beings are portrayed as suppressing this truth. Now, this is going to be huge in a moment, but think of the act of suppression just for a second. One of the things that I like to think of as sort of illustrative of this is when you're in a swimming pool. You ever done this? You have a ball and you push the ball down and you act like the ball's not there. Right? The ball is underneath the water. You could have your eyes up and act like you don't see the ball. But the only way you can be suppressing the ball is if you're in contact with the ball, right? You can't suppress it unless you're in contact with it. And this gives you something of an indication of what Paul's saying. It's not that the unbeliever is just lying to you. It's more profound than that. Paul's suggesting that the unbeliever is not just suppressing it from you, but from himself. And there are myriad examples of self-deception. In fact, as a little aside, I was thinking on my drive up of my own experience. I remember my mom, great mom, good Italian mom. She would always insist that I was an angel. But I can tell you, I came out of the womb going astray. I got in trouble from my infancy. I don't remember some of it, but I've heard the reports. I was getting in trouble from my infancy. I got in trouble every single grade. I was kicked out of every high school I was ever at in my hometown. So I got in trouble all the time. But if you ask my mother, I could do no wrong. If you ask my dad, he knew better, right? I was always surprised when my dad thought I was innocent because he usually knew I wasn't innocent. But what was interesting was sometimes my mom, she would show that while she insisted that I was innocent, there were times when I saw some chinks in the armor. There were times when, for example, relatives would come in from out of town with their children and they'd say, hey, why don't we let the kids go out to the movies or something? And then we'll do this. And my mom would say, oh, no, I think the kids should stay inside. She really didn't want me going out with them. And the reason was she thought we were probably going to get in trouble. My mom knew she would get an embarrassed look on her face, but she really did seem sincere when she thought and argued that I was an angel. That's the kind of thing that I mean. I don't mean to use my mother as an example of self-deception. I probably should have chosen something different, but great mother, the whole point is self-deception is a reality. We often don't like certain things, and so we try to suppress them. What Paul is saying is that's what the unbeliever is doing. He does not like the idea that God exists. He doesn't like the implications of it. So he wants to bury it. He wants it out of sight. He wants to live as if there is no, if he acknowledges God exists, then what does that mean for his life? Right? Jesus said people won't come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. He's saying they have this idea of what the light is and what its implications are. If they acknowledge it, if they come into the light, then it exposes them for who they are. So this gives the unbeliever a strong motivation to argue. When David was talking about the extreme skeptics, why are they doing that? Because they don't want to get to the conclusion. They've got a strong bias not to like that conclusion. And so that's a huge factor when you're talking with people. But Paul says God has revealed himself to them. And notice how strong Paul puts this. He says, for what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Now, I think this is wonderfully encouraging. When I go to talk to an unbeliever, I'm always thinking I'm talking to a person that God has already borne abundant witness to. One time I went to a context with, these were actually other Christians, and we held a different theological position. They're Christians. That was just a different point of theology. And so they're all on the other side of it. And it was just me and this other person. So there's 10 of them. And one of the groups said, they go, well, this is a little awkward. They go, somebody's outnumbered here. And I said, don't worry, fellas. I said, I'll have my friend leave so we can even the odds. But that's how I feel when I go into any evangelistic endeavor. I think I'm going into this conversation and talking to a creature of God who's surrounded and hounded by God's revelation, who has a conscience given him by God, who has a nature that is itself a witness to who God is. They're made in the image of God. Their very image cries out that God exists. So I'm already talking to somebody that God has already worked over. Now, of course, that doesn't deal with the truth suppression, but I already know there's this much on my side, this much going for the conversation. Well, as Paul goes on, he says his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. Now, how many of you know, can anybody guess what word Paul uses here for without an excuse? So it's the word excuse negated. Anybody have a guess which Greek word? Apologia. Paul says they're without an apologetic. That's what he literally says. They have no apologetic. He doesn't say that they have good reason to think that God exists, but there's some good reason also to doubt it. He doesn't say that there's 5% probability that it's not true. Paul says they have no apologetic. They have no excuse. Now, does this mean that we don't give evidence to people? We don't reason with them? No, that's I think that's false. If that was the conclusion, what are you going to do with the New Testament? It's appealing to evidence all over the place. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul's talking about all the witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. But part of what this tells us, though, is that our presentation of this sort of thing has to be has to be done in a way that is consistent with the claims that the apostles were making, that Christianity is certainly true, inescapably true. So how do we do this sort of thing? Well, one of the, I don't know if you've heard of Archimedes. I'm sure everybody's heard his name somewhere along the lines, but he was the famous mathematical genius of Syracuse. One of the things that he was known for was figuring out how to use levers and pulleys to move things. One of the boasts that he made at one point is he said, "Give me somewhere to stand and a lever, and I can move the world." So he's basically saying the only reason I can't move the world is because I don't have a foundation on which to stand that gives me the leverage to do that. Otherwise, I could. Well, this statement of Archimedes has been used throughout the history of philosophy. On my PowerPoints, I had a bunch of slides showing you how rationalists, empiricists, pragmatists, all the different epistemological approaches have used this to say that reason is the foundation. It's that on which we can stand in order to know things. They use this to illustrate how the senses are the foundation on which we must stand to know things. Well, what the Christian claims, if we're being biblical, is that the foundation on which we stand in order to know anything, in order to leverage things in the world, is the triune God. That is the unshakable, immovable foundation, that and his revelation in Scripture, on which we can stand, and in terms of which we can present evidence and demand of sinners that they believe this, that they repent and believe this. So what does this sort of thing look like? Well, I'll give you a variety of examples. Some of them, there's a variety of worldviews out there. So some of my examples will use atheism as a foil. I'll use Buddhism, Islam. There's all sorts of things that come into play here. But I'll try and give you a variety so you get something of a flavor of this. Well, consider this. One of the things that I spent the 10 hours driving just thinking of, some of these ways that might be helpful for people to think about this. One of the things that we say when it comes to interpreting a verse, what do we say? What's the number one rule when it comes to interpreting a verse? Context, right? So a statement's meaning depends on its context, right? Well, how much context? If I said to you, or if I told you that I said to my wife, let's put that on the table, right? What does that mean? Well, it depends the context. It could mean a variety of things. If we had just gone to the store and we bought a vase, and then I said in that context, let's put this on the table, then she would understand me to say, this is where I think it would look good. But if we're talking about how we're going to spend certain money or something like that, and there are different ideas, and we say, let's put this on the table, we're basically saying, let's include this in the things that we're considering, right? Context determines meaning. That's not just true when it comes to language, but when it comes to everything. If you were walking into a room and you open the door and you see a young boy on a table, and then there's two men there, and one man is holding the little boy down while another man shoves a sharp object into him, you might be mortified if you saw this. David wouldn't. David would say, let's see where this is going. I agitate David to my own he has opportunity to get me back, but no, if you saw this, you'd naturally recoil from this. This is horrendous. What's going on here? Suppose I give you more of the context. Suppose I include this additional detail. I say the little boy is a child who got bit by a snake. One of the men is his father. The other man is a doctor. He got bit by a snake. He needs the antivenom. He needs the cure, but he hates needles. So the father's holding him down while the doctor administers the cure. That just changed everything, didn't it? It now looks entirely different. So context is crucial, determinative of meaning. Well, if you extend things out and out and out, you eventually realize that if you keep this up, if the context can impinge on the meaning and you keep this up, then eventually you would have to come to the conclusion, and don't get too worried when I say this, you're going to be a little frightened here. You eventually start to realize the only way you could know anything at all is if you knew everything. You'd have to know the overall context of everything, because any additional information could alter what you thought you understood. You see what I mean? What this means is, and this is what scientists will say, they always say that scientific conclusions are provisional. Why are they saying that? Because an additional fact around the corner could change what we thought we knew. So science in its very nature, its conclusions are provisional. As far as we know, this is the way things are. But tomorrow we might find out differently. Well, that means then that for all of us, without knowing everything, we can never really say we know anything for certain. Now, who could possibly not have this problem on his hands? Who is there, just theoretically, hypothetically for a moment, who could possibly never be in that scenario where a new fact could alter what he thought he knew? God, right? There's no new facts for God. God knows everything. There are no new facts. Every fact is a created fact. The world was made by him. It's upheld by him. In him we live and move and have our being. It all is directed to the end that he has for it. There are no new facts to God. He declares the end from the beginning and from ancient times, what has not yet been done. The prophet Isaiah said, there are no new facts for God. So God could never find a new fact and then say, oh, got to alter what I thought there. And so guess who else now can know something for certain? Anybody who has a word from God. You can know that word, even if you don't know everything, you know him who does know everything. There's a great Christian philosopher that was a very profound man. I always loved when he gave these little down-to-earth illustrations. If you knew, if I had time to talk more about him, you'd realize it's pretty incredible that this man had this humble mindset. He was a veritable genius, but he would talk about the world and how much mystery there is out there. And he likened it to a child walking through the woods, and it's dark and there's noises, there are unexplained things. He doesn't know what's happening. And he says, my unity, this is an illustration for how he makes his way through the world. He says, my unity is like that of a child walking with its father through the woods. The child knows, well, I don't know what's going on here, and I've got all these concerns, but I'm with my father. My father will protect me. And so he's using this as just a very simple illustration of how the Christian navigates the world. We don't know everything, but we do know him who does. And because of that, we can have confidence in what he's told us. And in light of that, which he's told us, we can know other things. Now, let me give you some. So that was kind of an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. Think of the different worldviews that are out there. Let's ask how these worldviews destroy knowledge in other ways, because they all do. David was talking about this as part of the presuppositionalist project. I grew up in Southern California. A lot of the people that had come into Southern California were Asian. There were a lot of Vietnamese people there. So some of my best friends growing up were Buddhists. They were from Vietnam. And I wasn't a Christian at the time, but I remember hearing a lot from them about what they believed. And I've talked to many other Buddhists over time and read a lot of the literature. And one of the things that Buddhists classically believe, there are different forms of Buddhism, but very standard stock and trade Buddhist belief is that all reality is one. There are no distinctions. The problems that we have in the world is because we make distinctions between right and wrong, true and false, these sorts of things. If we could get beyond this, then everything would be better, because all is fundamentally one. So you've probably heard the old joke, what the Buddhist monk said to the hot dog vendor. You heard this? Make me one with everything. So that's essentially Buddhism. All is one. Well, it's amazing to me, if a Buddhist actually lived in a way that was consistent with his philosophy, he couldn't function in the world at all. he has to live as if Buddhism is false. The simple act, years ago, I read a little pamphlet by a guy named Doug Jones. If you can find it, it's worth getting. And it's called Rethinking Milk Buying. Rethinking Milk Buying. And what he was saying is the simple act of going to the store and buying milk refutes a whole host of worldviews contrary to Christianity. Imagine the Buddhist monk going to the store, buying milk, going to the checkout counter, paying the checker the money and getting his change and leaving. All of this presupposes things that just aren't true on Buddhism. First of all, if all is one, why does he go to the store? Doesn't that assume that where he was at before isn't the same place as the store? When he gets to the store and he buys it and he pays the checkout counter, he expects the guy to give him back a certain amount of money. If it was $1, it's probably not $1 anymore. But when I was a kid, it was $1. He expects $4 back. But if all is one, what's the difference between giving him $1 back and giving him 2 or 3 or all of this activity presupposes something fundamentally out of accord with this man's fundamental belief. I was telling some people the other day about one conversation I had with a Buddhist. I had this friend who, whenever he moved a lot. This is when I lived in Vegas, and we had these deals where one person would be bad cop, the other would be good cop in certain scenarios. That's where somebody would say the hard things that people might get offended by, but that they need to hear. And the other person would, approach it a little bit differently. And we're hoping that through this, we're helping them see their need for Christ and so forth. Well, in this scenario, he lives in this neighborhood and this guy's his neighbor. So he wants me to come be bad cop so he can be on good relations with his neighbor. So I come over to the house and I'm sitting across from this guy. We've got coffee and so forth. And I asked him, I said, hey, I'm curious about what you believe. Maybe you could tell me something about this. I think I know, but I know there are versions of Buddhism. So maybe you could just tell me what it is that you think. Where do you think reality came from? What is its nature? Who am I? Where am I going? What should I be doing in the world? Just, things like that. And so this guy begins giving me the typical spiel. All is one. Reality is fundamentally one. There are no distinctions. That's all illusory. And our problems arise from failing to see that. We need to realize that we're like drops in an infinite ocean that really have no individual identity, right? Once they drop into the ocean, there's just this undefined mass of water. And so I'm listening to that, and he said a bunch of other things. And I said, okay, so here's what I believe. And so I start talking to him. I said, my belief involves a fundamental distinction from the outset. I believe that there's an all-knowing, sovereign, personal God who made the world. The world is other than himself. And that world itself is full of a variety of things, an incredible array of different things. But it's not just a chaos because it's subject to the control of God. He holds everything together. He's directing it in accordance with his purpose to a purposed end. And that God made man in his image, and man as his image bearer is expected to image him. He's expected to think his thoughts after him. He's expected to act in certain ways that glorify God. And because man hasn't done that, there's going to come a day of judgment. God can't deny himself. So when people that were made in his image besmirch that image, he's going to hold them to account. So there's a final day of reckoning. But God in his graciousness has sent his son. And before I could even get further into the gospel, this guy just sort of lost it. And he began, hurling all sorts of abuse at me, calling me all sorts of names. Now, usually my first thought when people do this, I listen to all the names, you're a jerk, you're an idiot, you're this. And then when they stop, I'm thinking, wait, why is he stopping? Because I could help you fill out the list. There's more, right? That's my whole reason for being a Christian is predicated on this. If I didn't think all that was true, then I wouldn't be a Christian. If I was healthy, I wouldn't need a doctor, right? So he's telling me all this, but it kind of reminds me of this. Another little aside. One time I had preached to a Muslim on the university campus in Las Vegas, and this Muslim was still sore from the day before, and he's coming through the quad area. And I see him coming from a distance, and he starts throwing down his stuff. He's throwing down his backpack. He's taking off his watch. And I'm thinking, oh, he's that upset, right? He's coming for business. And as he's getting closer to me, he starts yelling, "Your God had his diapers changed. Your God was whipped. He had his beard plucked out. He was nailed to a cross." And my initial temptation when I was hearing that was, okay, first of all, he's causing a scene. I wasn't causing a scene. I was there to witness to people. And I wasn't at this point preaching. I was just talking to people. And so he's causing a scene, and I'm thinking, he's kind of changing the mood here. And he wants to come hit me, obviously. So I'm thinking, how do I regain control of this? Now, my initial thought was to push back. My God walked on water. He stilled the winds and the waves. He gave sight to the blind. But I started thinking, well, wait a minute. This man, in spite of himself, is preaching the gospel. So I stepped back as he was getting really close, and I said, "Preach it, brother, preach it." And his face got red with embarrassment. And I like to think on occasion that several people got saved that day through his preaching. It's possible. Well, this man, going back to the original story, this man's calling me all these names. So my first thought is, yeah, and, keep going. But then I start thinking, and I say to him, I say, wait a minute. I said, we just exchanged worldviews. You just told me all is one, and our problems arise from making distinctions. So when you were calling me all these names, in your mind, what were you doing? Were you saying all that about yourself? Right? Why am I this as opposed to something? Why am I a jerk as opposed to a nice guy? Right? Why am I, all these bad things as opposed to something else, something positive? I mean, I don't understand. Are you saying there's something wrong with being a jerk? I thought you don't make moral distinctions. Right? All of a sudden, how's this man living? He's living like a Christian in spite of his worldview. He says all is one, but he doesn't live that way. He's acting like a truth suppressor. He says he doesn't believe this God, he doesn't believe these sorts of things, but how is he living? He can't live consistently with his worldview. And this is not only true of Buddhists. David gave you some examples of atheists. One of the things that I think of when it comes to atheists is, so let me take this example. So maybe this will be a little, I'll use the example of science. Some of you philosophy may not be your thing, which is fine. So I won't spend too much time here. But one of the things that David Hume said as an atheist is, as an atheist, we have no basis for believing in what we refer to in some contexts as induction, that's a legitimate thing to do. That's, even though not everybody's philosophically oriented, perhaps you all do this, right? If I asked you, if I lit a match or a lighter right now and I asked somebody to come hold their hand in it, most of you are going to say no. And anybody that says yes, probably, it's not because you don't know what's going to happen, but maybe you've got a streak of self-mutilation or something. I don't know. But the fact is, everybody knows not to touch the flame. It'll burn you. Okay? Now, how long did it take you to learn that? One time touching a flame usually results in a person never wanting to touch a flame again. And if you do, it's accidental, right? You were careless or something like that. Well, think about what this implies about reality. Where did you get the idea that what you saw happening right here at this particular moment was true in all other instances of this? You haven't experienced every flame in the world, have you? How do you know that the next time you touch a flame, it's going to burn you? What you're assuming, and this is recognized by philosophers like David Hume, who, by the way, puts to shame contemporary atheists. People like Dawkins don't hold a candle to David Hume. David Hume really was a brilliant man. He was an atheist, but he was made in the image of God. He was utterly brilliant. So was Bertrand Russell. And both of them said this principle that we all assume has no foundation given atheism. Because what you're doing is you're assuming that what you experience in one place is a type of event so that where you experience that same sort of thing elsewhere, it has the same results. We all do this. We learn from experience. You experience something one time or two times or three times, and you eventually generalize it, right? One instance, two instances of touching a flame lead you to conclude, okay, fire burns. So you don't have to have universal experience to draw the conclusion from a couple of examples that fire burns. But here's why David Hume and Bertrand Russell had a problem with this as atheists. They'd say, first of all, as atheists, they said all knowledge is based on observation. Well, how many of you have observed all instances of fire? So you don't have universal observation. It all rests on this idea that nature is uniform. But wait a minute, do atheists have this belief that nature is uniform? And if it's uniform, maybe it's just uniform today, but not tomorrow. Why do we project onto the world this continuity? It all seems to assume that we live in an orderly world. But on the principles of atheism, there's no basis for that belief. And I could do this in a more sophisticated way, but just understand David Hume and Bertrand Russell, far more sophisticated than me, that already admitted this. Okay, they admit that this is a colossal problem and it cannot be solved, and it hasn't been solved to this day. Well, think about something else that we use. It would be a little more philosophical here again for a few minutes. The principles of logic. Logic is not like other things in your experience, right? There are rocks, there are chairs, there are trees, there are people, there are flowers, there are rivers and lakes and so forth. Logic isn't like that, right? Logic, these refer to laws of thought, how we're supposed to think, right? Logic isn't something you can go to the store and purchase. You can't get a pound of logic, right? You can't take logic and put it under a microscope. So logic is immaterial. It's abstract, to use the technical philosophical term. It's abstract. Logic is also invariant. It doesn't change. The law of non-contradiction. You don't wake up and say, okay, well, maybe I can contradict myself today, and both statements will be true, right? We always assume each time we wake up that logic is just like it was the day before. That's how we function in the world. Logic is a consistent thing, so it's invariant. So it's abstract, it's invariant, and it's universal. It's not like, contradictions are false at my house, but not at your house, right? You can't contradict yourself anywhere and be right in both statements, right? So think of the qualities of logic. They're abstract, they're invariant, and they're universal. Starting to sound like anyone you know, right? Immaterial criteria or laws of thought that we're to reason according to, that don't fit into a materialistic framework. Whenever the unbeliever reasons, he's employing logic, and if they're an atheist, well, then what are they doing using these things? These aren't the kinds of things that exist in their worldview. If I say only marbles exist, and I say, here's this non-marble that proves it, I'm appealing to something that I say doesn't exist in my worldview. Well, when the unbeliever uses logic, it doesn't exist in his worldview if he's being true to his worldview. What are these people doing when they engage in this sort of thing? Well, they're relying upon the God they know. They're suppressing the truth, but they know it. They're relying upon this God while denying him by their truth-suppressing worldviews. So notice, by the way, though, that what I'm doing, it's not the same kind of evidence, but it is evidence. You're offering arguments, reasons. Notice what you're doing, my friend, my unbelieving friend. You're saying God does not exist, and you're saying I'm wrong if I don't live up to these absolute standards. You're saying God does not exist, and then you're turning around and saying there are laws of thought. You're saying God doesn't exist, and then you're turning around and talking about laws that govern reality, that govern nature. Sounds to me like you sound like a legalist, I got to tell you. There are all these laws in your system. Who's the lawgiver? Who by what standard? Who laid down all these laws that you want us to live by? Right? I thought that we were supposedly the intolerant ones. Now you keep beating me over the head with all these laws. But what are laws in a world that is only matter in motion and so forth? So here I've given you a couple of examples. Buddhism. I've given you the example of atheism, logic, science. Now let me kind of move this a little bit, and I don't know how much time I have left or not, but I was expecting Elle to pick up that cue. But anyways, 15 minutes. Okay. So one of the things that people will sometimes say is, okay, well, this deals with the question of theism. Theism is belief in God, and shows that there are problems with atheism. But how does this show not just that theism is true, but Christian theism is true? Now, one thing I want to say here is, first of all, understand I'm not speaking endlessly here. Okay, 15 minutes. Obviously, I don't pretend that I'm saying everything. There's a whole lot more that could be said. There's all kinds of evidence that can be brought in. I've already said that I fully endorse using evidences. But in this context, I don't think evidence is intelligible outside of a Christian context. I don't think it makes sense to say, here's this evidence, right, using logic, using empirical knowledge that appeals to induction or the uniformity. I don't think it's consistent on atheism to do that. So I'm just saying you have to present the evidence in this framework. But what I'm going to do a little bit of is kind of show you how you begin to extend this kind of reasoning into a particular direction, not just in terms of general theism, but Christian theism. What we believe as Christians is not only that there is a personal God, we believe God is tripersonal, right? We believe that God is three persons, one God, three persons. Some groups will say that's irrational, right? Notice they're appealing to logic, right? That's irrational. Now, in my view, rationality is a reflection of the way God thinks and expects us to think. And so if we want to know whether a belief about God is rational, then the criteria for that is his revelation. We don't have the authority to challenge his revelation. If it's his revelation and that's what it says, then we're obligated to believe it. But the unbeliever will say that belief in a triune God is irrational. Muslims, for example, will say this is belief in three gods. No matter how much we say we don't believe in three gods, they'll insist on this, and on it goes. Well, one of the things that they share with us, as do Jews, is belief that God is self-existent. God is independent. God doesn't depend upon anything. I was saying the other day, it's one of my favorite things to bring up because it hit me so hard when I was a non-Christian reading the Bible in Exodus 3 when Moses asked God his name. He says, "What is your name, so that I may tell the children of Israel who it is that sent me to you?" What's happened is God told Moses he's going to lead the people out of Egypt. He's supposed to go and tell them. And naturally, these people are going to ask questions. Oh, you heard a voice out of a bush, did you? Right? We need something better, Moses, if we're going to try and leave Egypt. So Moses asked God for his name. That's what he's going to bring back to the people of Israel. When I first read that, I did stop and I was like, well, I'm not really sure I get the logic here. How is the name of God going to settle this for them? Well, how does God reply to Moses? He said, I am who I am. When I heard that for the first time, and I'm not suggesting I understood it as well then as I do now, or that I understand it now as well as I will on into eternity, but it was a powerful statement to me because at least this much was operative in my mind. If somebody asks me who I am, I'm going to reply, I'm going to say, I'm going to give you my name. That doesn't go very far, right? It's not like a Hebrew name that has meaning. It's just a sound. But I'm going to say my parents are so-and-so. They came from here. My maternal grandparents were from Sicily. Notice I'm referring to things outside of myself as reference points. It'd be like if we were to say, where's Lodi? Where you're going to say, oh, Lodi is next to this city, which is over here and next to that. You have to have some reference point. If I say, I caught a fish this long, all of you are looking for what? Where's my other hand? You need a reference point. Well, how's the God of heaven and earth, who exists apart from them, who is self-existent, what's he going to point to define himself? Nothing. There is nothing to point to beyond himself. So he defines himself in terms of himself. He is his own reference point. How long am I? This long, right? I am who I am. That's what God is saying. I don't look to something beyond me to explain me. I contain within myself everything necessary to account for who I am. So think about this. What do we believe about God? What do we believe in concert with Muslims? We believe that God is personal. What does personal mean? Right? To be personal means you're self-aware. You're aware of yourself in distinction from others. Right? A person is a communicative being, a speaking being. A person speak. That's something we do. We communicate. We express ourselves. Persons love. We have love towards one another. We engage in all sorts of things, and that's what it means to be a person. Well, how does this work in the case of Allah? Who does Allah speak to? Who does Allah love? Where are all these things in this deity? Now, what the Muslim will say is, well, Allah loves the world. Right? Now, if you read the Quran, his love is pretty defective, even at that. He doesn't love the world. He loves, the Muslim that's fighting and slaying and chopping off people's fingers and head, right? That's what he loves. He doesn't love the sinner and all the rest. So his love is defective even at that. But I protest here that even this, it strikes me as problematic. If you're saying that this is definitional of who your God is, notice that the definition requires bringing in the world to do this. This God is not self-contained. He's not self-explained. He doesn't define himself in terms of himself. He has to point to something outside of himself in order to be explained. He's not the final explanation of everything. He's not the eternally, independently existing God. You only get that in the triune God of Scripture. So Muslims, what are they doing when they have their God speaking? When they have their God expressing love? He's acting like the God of Christianity, but he's not that God. So it's the same scenario. They're suppressing the truth about God, but speaking in ways that presuppose that God. You ever noticed in the Quran? I mean, Allah does this all the time. One of the things Allah does in the Quran, Christians caught him short on this, he has Allah saying we all the time. We created, we decreed, we sent down. Why is Allah talking this way? Now, here's the answer I've heard from Muslims. Think about this. Muslims will say, oh, that's just the plural of majesty. I've heard even some Jews say this. Some Christians erroneously have picked this up. They'll say it's the plural of majesty. And what's the idea behind the plural of majesty? The idea is that by introducing the plurality of something, it shows its richness, its fullness, its effulgence, right? Well, why would a Unitarian being have to point to plurality as a way of indicating his majesty? Wouldn't the ultimate example of majesty be just solitariness, barrenness, aloofness, aloneness, existing in an eternal void or vacuum or whatever, however you want to describe this? No, we instinctively know that the majesty is sort of illustrated in a richness of pomp and splendor, fullness, plurality. That unity without plurality doesn't bespeak majesty. They seem to instinctively know this. So, but in any case, why is Muhammad doing this in the Quran? Well, let's run with this idea. Perhaps he's doing it to try and give fullness to this deity. But why does he have to do that if his God is the self-contained God? Now, my view is that Muhammad picked this up from Jews and Christians without understanding why this God speaks this way. Jews don't know why either, but he's picking this up from the Christian worldview. They understand at some level that you can't have a God who is absolutely one without any diversity. Now, by the way, think about this, and I think I'll wrap it up with this. One of the fundamental problem of philosophy, and I wish I could spend more time on this, perhaps it should have been my chief example, but at least I'll whet your appetite. The original problem of philosophy, interestingly enough, is called the problem of the one and the many. The problem of the one and the many. If you look at the pre-Socratic philosophers, the Ionian philosophers before Socrates, what happened was they were looking around at the world and they saw the incredible diversity of it all. But they realized that in order to understand it, there had to be some unity to this diversity. Without unity in the midst of this diversity, then it's all chaos and old night. It's all unintelligible. Think about it this way. It's basically if either all is one or all is many is kind of how they're thinking. But either one of those is problematic. If you think about a dictionary, if I say all is one, then a dictionary should only have one word in it. What does that word mean? If you just had one word in the dictionary, how would you ever understand it? How do you understand any other words? If you look at a dictionary, it's defined by other words. You have multiple words brought in to explain the meaning of this word. So if all is one, then you just have one word and no definition. So a blank unity, absolute unity, would be a blank. It would mean nothing. It would be empty. But imagine if you had nothing but diversity, nothing that tied things together. One word wouldn't relate to the next word. You couldn't bring in a word to explain another one because they're all fundamentally discontinuous. They don't have any unity to them. What you need is both unity and diversity. And what Christians are saying is that's who our God is. He's both one and many, unity and diversity. And that God is the one who created this world of unity and diversity. He created everything that's in the world, and he holds it all together. The unity that's back of all things in the world is the triune God. And this God created just this world. The reason the world is like this, the reason people are what they are. Why are we, who are made in God's image, necessarily social beings? Why did God say when he made Adam, why did he say it's not good for the man to be alone? Why not? Adam was made in his image. Isn't God absolutely alone? Why wasn't it good for Adam, his image bearer, to be alone? Wouldn't that be exactly what is perfect? All this presupposes the Christian worldview. So it's only in terms of this God that in the final analysis that is fully self-contained, fully self-explained. Unless we have such a God, then we can't point to that God and say he's the one who explains the world. If he's not intelligible in himself and in terms of himself, without reference to anything else, then he can't be the final reference point for everything else in the world. The God of Islam can't do this. Only the God of Christianity can. Now, again, I'll remind you of this. I'm not pretending that I've said everything. There's a whole lot more. I absolutely believe that there's evidence for the resurrection, the empty tomb, the witness of the disciples. I'm not suggesting to you that you don't bring this in. I'm just saying there's a larger context to this too, that you should really bring to bear on your non-Christian friend. Hold their feet to the fire. Ask them, if you're really going to tell me there is no God, why are you condemning me for telling you need to believe in Jesus as if I'm being intolerant? What's wrong with being intolerant on your worldview? Right? If you're a Muslim and you don't think what I'm doing is loving, why should I be loving? Your God certainly doesn't give me any reason to be loving. Your God doesn't love certain groups of people. So I just put you in that category. And so I don't love you. It just doesn't hold together. So I hope this was somewhat helpful to you. And I'll conclude with that. And questions? Be easy on me. Yeah.
So what would you say is one of the strongest arguments for proving the Bible is true?
So there's a couple things that could be said. I'll give part of this, but it's in this Bible that we get this understanding of God that I'm saying is necessary to account for the world. If you don't believe the message of this book, then I don't think you can make anything intelligible. At the end of the day, I think that you don't have anything to stand on to move the world, right? You can't make one thing intelligible without this God. And that's what I would expect, right? Jesus said, a person who doesn't build his house on the rock, he's building his house on sand. And ultimately, that house is going to come crashing down. And so that's something of the argument. But I think that, you could also bring in all the traditional stuff that Christians point to. This word one of the things I could have said along with this, and I sort of did this a little bit, but I'm arguing this God is omniscient. This God made the world. This God governs the world. The reason that logic applies to the world is because logic is a reflection of God's thinking, and God created the world in accordance with his rational character. So logic and reality have a relationship in this fact that God made and sustains them. But what I could have gone on to do is show how in the Bible God illustrates that he is this omniscient God. Let me put it this way. So sometimes if you ask people, what is the gospel? They'll say, well, Jesus died, he was buried, he rose again. And I wouldn't, in some contexts that's adequate, but that's just shorthand, right? If you want to be more apostolic, you have to say Christ died for our sins. That's the gospel, and then the rest of it, right? What this is not just a historical fact, but a historical fact along with an interpretation. You're not just saying that he died, but you're saying what his death did. His death atoned for sin. The one is an empirical fact. You can observe, if you were there, you could observe Jesus dying. But what you couldn't observe is that he was dying for our sins, right? That is a non-observable thing. So here's what's happening in this. You have the fact given in the Bible and its interpretation. Now, if you think about interpretation, how do we know whose interpretation is right when it comes to something? If I say this fact means this and you say this fact means that. Well, I got one way that you can trump anyone in this situation and say this is the one whose interpretation rules. How about if this one told you this fact before it was a fact? Right? If this one already knows the fact before it ever was a fact, then it suggests that he has some priority over these facts. He's somehow over them, right? Basically what I'm driving at is God is the one who governs history, and so he holds the keys to its interpretation. But this is the whole point that's being made in the book of Isaiah. If you read Isaiah 40 through 55, there's a whole section in there called the trial of the gods, where the Lord is laying down, throwing down the gauntlet and challenging the false gods that the people were going after and saying, let these gods come and prove that they're gods. Let them tell you anything that's going to happen, whether good or bad, so that we can all fear together. God's mocking them. Show us that you're gods, and we'll all, shudder along with you. Our knees will knock together. The Lord does this often in the prophets, which shows you, by the way, there's some grounds for mockery, even on the part of believers, but that has to be tempered. Don't go too wild with that. But the Lord mocks the idolaters, right? And what he's saying is, I've declared these things to you in advance. I've declared these things to you before they ever happen. And if he told you these things were going to happen before they did, don't you think you ought to listen to what he tells you they mean? If he has this kind of relationship to the facts, that he knows them before they are, I would listen to that one. He seems to be in a relationship to the facts in a way that nobody else is. His interpretation, the one who gives the fact before it is a fact, I'm suggesting also gives the interpretation. He's the one interpreting these things for us. And so who is the Muslim to come along after the fact and say, no, my interpretation of the crucifixion is true? Why should I believe you when you're the Johnny come lately here, right? You're a new arrival. And isn't that what God says in the prophet Isaiah? He says these new gods, these strange gods, they're new gods on the scene. Why should we listen to these beings? Where were they when I was declaring all these things? So that's part of what I think all this goes into a case for the Bible. And there's so much more. I mean, predictive prophecy, there's textual transmission. We've got an incredible treasure of embarrassing riches in manuscript. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that goes into proving the Bible is the Word of God. I'd love to spend 3 hours doing just that, but
thank you.
Yeah. Now I'm scared.
If we in the Quran is for majesty, why did Allah say I, me, mine, myself in the Quran? And why we never read anywhere in the Quran Pharaoh or any of the other kings use the word we?
Yeah. So Osama's asking standard things that he knows I know the answer to. He's just setting me up to spike the. No, this is. I don't mean that in a bad sense. He's just he thinks there's value in hearing this. So, and I agree. In the Quran, one of the things that I heard Muslims say is when Allah's trying to talk about His Majesty, He uses the plural. When He speaks in the singular, He's trying to show His intimacy, His love, His compassion. And so I just went through the Quran and I said, let's see if this holds up. And it's just not true. There are many times when He uses the singular, when He's trying to show how great He is. And there are other times where He uses the plural, where He's trying to show how near and compassionate He is. There's no consistency in this. So that's just not true. Number two, as Osama pointed out, you don't find royalty in the Quran talking that way. Pharaoh doesn't talk that way. None of the kings in the Quran talk that way. But a third thing is that Muslim scholars recognize there's no such thing as a plural of majesty in Hebrew or Arabic. M.A.S. Abdel Halim wrote an article called Iltifat. Iltifat is I get a kick out of it, but it's the Muslim attempt to pretend that one of the miracles of the Quran is what we call gobbledygook. They're trying to turn into a miracle. And it's this phenomena where the Quran, it has no consistency it'll switch suddenly from God speaking in the first person to speaking in the third person or the second person in the same verse. And so you read the Quran and you think, wait a minute, is there a different person now speaking? What's going on here? Who's this? This is all over the Quran. And it's a mishmash. It's like, who in the world put this book together? It's like it was written by a third grader. And then Muslims turn around, this is part of the eloquence of the Quran. No other book is like this. And I'm like, well, no other book after the third grade is like this, right? But so he writes this article and he's trying to explain why Allah speaks in the plural. And he says, point blank, this is a Muslim scholar. He says there's no such thing as a plural of majesty in Arabic. One last thing is this. At one point in Muhammad's life, he sent people into other places in Arabia, allegedly, and they were preaching the Quran. They were reciting the chapters of the Quran, and they eventually got down into southern Arabia, where there was a group of Christians. They're Arabs. This is critically important. They're Christians, but they're Arabs. They speak Arabic. Well, they go up to Muhammad to ask him questions about his revelation, and the Christians of Najran. And they say, okay, Muhammad, we've got some questions for you. If Jesus is not the Son of God, who's his father? That's the first question. If he's not God, then how did he create clay birds and bring them to life? They're referring to one of his surahs where he says Jesus made clay birds and brought them to life. And then they say, if Allah's only one, why does he speak in the plural? Why does he say we created, we decreed, we sent down? And Muslims here will immediately say it's the plural of majesty. But notice, these are Christians they say, if you knew Arabic, you'd understand. These were Arabs. They knew Arabic. They knew it better than you do. They spoke 7th century Arabic. And they're asking Muhammad, and guess what Muhammad said? He doesn't say, plural of majesty, obviously. At first, he says, I don't have an answer right now. I'll bring you one tomorrow. So for years, he's been speaking this way, and he doesn't know what his God is saying, right? He says we hundreds of times in the Quran. So this whole time, Muhammad never thought, why in the world are you saying that? So he comes back the next day, and here's the answer. Get ready for Allah's answer. Allah says, there are some verses in the Quran that are clear, and there are others that are unclear, and only Allah knows what they mean. Those who pursue an understanding of them have diseased hearts and are pursuing strife and fitna. So Allah's answer to the Christians of Najran is, hey, some stuff in there is just not so clear. You might think this is the perfect time then for the one who knows what they mean to tell us. But instead, he says there's some things that are clear, there's some things that are unclear. And anybody who's questioning these unclear verses, they show that they have a diseased heart. This is basically an ad hominem fallacy, right? You're questioning me about the rationality of this, and I'm going to say, that just shows you're a wicked individual. And I'm being signaled to stop.